For a long time, the self has been treated as a problem, as something that stands in the way, a center that must be questioned, challenged, or overcome. This way of framing the issue leaves something unexplored. The difficulty has always been one of location, a question that lies at the heart of deep inner work and Jungian psychology, of understanding where the self actually stands within the wider field of experience. This question rarely appears in moments of comfort. It emerges during transitions, loss, crisis, periods when familiar identities no longer hold. The self feels active and demanding, yet insufficient as a final point of reference. This quiet tension often marks the beginning of deeper inner work. This is where an unexpected proximity appears. Long before modern psychology, Vedanta was already examining experience through a similar movement of inquiry, not as theory, but as sustained observation of consciousness itself. To follow this line of thought, we need a guide who took symbols seriously, who distrusted shortcuts, and who understood that the psyche speaks through images rather than doctrines. That guide is Carl Jung. If this way of thinking resonates with you, you're welcome to stay with us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn notifies on. When people speak about the self, they usually refer to the part that thinks, chooses, reacts, and acts. The familiar center of daily life, often taken as the whole of who we are. Carl Jung treated this center as real and necessary, the point from which perception, choice, and personal responsibility arise. At the same time, he recognized that conscious awareness occupies only part of the psychic landscape. Beyond the ego, Jung described a deeper organizing principle, often referred to as the Carl Jung self. This principle holds conscious life and unconscious processes within a single dynamic whole. Psychological development, in this framework, does not aim at replacing the ego, but at establishing a living relationship between conscious identity and this wider psychic order. Jung observed that when the ego identifies itself as the whole of the psyche, life gradually loses depth, meaning becomes fragile. Decisions turn reactive. Conflict repeats itself in different forms. This is not a moral failure. It is a structural imbalance. The psyche seeks totality. When consciousness narrows, symptoms begin to speak on its behalf. Dreams intensify. Emotional reactions sharpen. Contradictions surface. These signals do not indicate pathology. They indicate a psyche seeking a broader reference point. This process unfolds gradually, through experience, through conflict, through integration. Jung called this movement individuation, or the individuation process. A central element of this process involves what Jung called the shadow. The inner shadow forms from traits, emotions, and impulses excluded from conscious identity. These elements do not disappear. They reorganize themselves indirectly. They emerge as projections, as recurring interpersonal conflicts, as exaggerated emotional responses. Engaging this material consciously became known as shadow work, or Jungian shadow work. This work does not involve indulgence or identification with darkness. It is a process of recognition. By integrating shadow material, energy previously bound in repression becomes available for psychological development. Far from weakening the ego, this process stabilizes it. Shadow work grounds individuation in lived experience, not abstraction. It supports emotional healing by restoring internal dialogue where fragmentation once prevailed. This emphasis explains Jung's caution toward spiritual awakening, understood as sudden transcendence. Encounters with unconscious material require grounding, stability, and gradual integration to support genuine psychological growth. This concern eventually led Jung to look beyond Western symbolic systems. Then when Jung turned toward Eastern traditions, his interest followed a psychological line of inquiry. He did not approach these systems as belief structures, but as symbolic languages developed through centuries of inward observation. In his writings, Jung spoke explicitly about Indian philosophy, including Vedanta and the Upanishads. What impressed him was not metaphysical certainty, but psychological maturity. He described the Upanishads as expressions of an inward turn, rarely matched in the Western tradition. Their focus lay on experience itself, on the source from which perception arises, on continuity beneath change. Across distant civilizations, similar images appeared. Centers, circles, mandalas, patterns of totality. For Jung, these recurring forms revealed structures inherent to the psyche. Meaning does not arise randomly. It organizes itself around deep symbolic patterns. Eastern traditions explored this inner terrain through disciplined attention, symbolic narrative, and sustained contemplation. Jung recognized in these systems a symbolic investigation parallel to psychology's own concerns. Symbols function as bridges. They allow consciousness to orient itself within depths that resist direct explanation. This symbolic movement naturally leads toward a central idea. In Vedantic language, the inquiry into experience converges around the concept of Atman. Atman refers to the underlying presence that makes experience possible. It points toward what many traditions describe as non-duality or non-dual awareness. Rather than describing personality or role, it gestures toward the true nature of the self as the ground in which experience unfolds. Inquiry gradually withdraws attention from observable contents toward the observer itself. Thought continues, emotion continues, perception unfolds as before. What shifts is identification. This observing presence carries continuity without narrative. Within this framework, self-realization appears as clarity regarding the structure of experience, not as a dramatic alteration of identity. Individuality remains active, now understood as an expression within a wider field of awareness. The ego continues to function. Its position becomes clearer. What emerges is a shift in orientation. At this stage, a careful clarification becomes necessary. Jung's self and Vedanta's Atman belong to different conceptual frameworks. Their relationship unfolds at the level of structure, not definition. Each tradition uses its own symbolic language to address a shared intuition. In psychology, the self names the organizing totality of the psyche. In Vedanta, Atman names the foundational presence within experience. Jung admired the clarity of Vedantic insight, yet he remained cautious. He warned that symbolic realizations, when adopted without psychological integration, can destabilize Western consciousness. The risk did not lie in Vedanta itself, but in imitation without context. Psychological development, he insisted, must unfold through lived experience. Symbols guide orientation. They do not replace inner work. This distinction preserves individuality while allowing access to wider dimensions of meaning. Individuality remains intact, now situated within a broader order. Many difficulties surrounding identity arise from questions of scale. Conscious identity often carries more responsibility than it can sustain, meaning coherence and self-worth become concentrated within a narrow center. Both Jungian psychology and Vedanta describe a different arrangement. Experience unfolds within layered structures. This shift is sometimes described as spiritual transformation or a quieter form of spiritual awakening. It does not depend on extraordinary states. It reflects a stable relationship with higher states of consciousness. These states refer less to intensity and more to capacity, the ability to hold complexity, to tolerate paradox, to respond without fragmentation. A familiar metaphor illustrates this movement. A wave carries form, motion, and duration. Its existence unfolds within the movement of the ocean. Recognition of the larger field clarifies the wave's nature. Orientation restores balance. Vedantic texts describe the horizon of this inquiry using the term Brahman. Psychology approaches such language through symbolic interpretation. Across cultures, the psyche generates images that represent totality, unity, and ground. These images function as organizing references, not as literal descriptions. In Jung's work, this movement corresponds to the collective dimension of the psyche, a shared symbolic field shaping myth, meaning, and culture. Different vocabularies respond to similar pressures. The individual seeks placement within a meaningful whole. Symbols mediate this relationship, supporting spiritual healing without fixing interpretation. Jung consistently returned insight to lived experience. Individuation unfolds within ordinary life. Through work, through relationship, through responsibility. As orientation deepens, inner conflict softens. Choice gains clarity. Meaning stabilizes. Freedom appears as the capacity to respond from coherence rather than fragmentation. Individuality remains present. Its relationship to the whole gains proportion. This marks a turning point in the spiritual journey. Life continues. Perspective widens. What emerges from this dialogue is a shift in reference. The self finds its place within a wider configuration. Ego, individuality, and personal history remain active. Orientation provides context. This movement explains the enduring resonance of both Jung and the Upanishads. They offer direction, not certainty. If this line of thinking speaks to you, you're welcome to continue with the next episodes in the series. Each one approaches the same question from a different symbolic tradition. The inquiry remains open. The position becomes clearer as the path unfolds.